The wind that night was not just cold, it was malicious, a biting chill that seemed to seep through the layers of skin and settle deep within the bones. Maya pulled the collar of her worn denim jacket tighter around her neck, but the fabric was thin and offered little protection against the relentless downpour. Underneath, her gray shirt was already damp, clinging to her skin like a second, freezing layer. At 28 years old, Maya carried the weight of a lifetime of sorrow in her eyes. The streets had been her home for 2 years, ever since the factory closed and the bills piled up faster than she could count them. She was invisible to the world, a ghost haunting the corners of the city, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers, which was becoming rarer by the day. She walked with her head down, counting the cracks in the pavement, trying to ignore the gnawing pain in her stomach that had become her constant companion. It had been 2 days since she last ate a proper meal, and her vision swam with dizzy spells every time she stood up too quickly. She turned the corner into a narrow, dimly lit alleyway, seeking shelter under the awning of an abandoned electronics store. It was her usual spot, hidden enough to be safe, but close enough to the main road to not feel completely isolated. That was when she saw it. Sitting next to a rusted dumpster, looking completely out of place against the grime and garbage, was a pristine brown leather suitcase. It looked expensive, the kind of luggage she used to see in magazine advertisements in waiting rooms. Maya paused, looking around to see if someone had forgotten it, but the street was empty. The silence of the city at midnight was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Curiosity warred with caution. In her world, touching something that wasn't yours could get you hurt, but desperation had a loud voice. She stepped closer, the water splashing over her worn sneakers. She reached out, her fingers brushing the smooth, expensive leather. It was heavy. With a shaking breath, she dragged it under the awning, out of the rain, and stared at the brass latches. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that echoed in her ears. She looked left, then right, ensuring no one was watching from the shadows. With trembling fingers, she unlatched the brass fittings. They clicked open with a smooth, satisfying sound that spoke of high-quality craftsmanship. She lifted the lid, and her breath hitched in her throat. The world seemed to stop spinning. Inside, neatly stacked in rows that filled the entire interior, were bundles of $100 bills. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, more money than she could ever dream of earning. $200,000. The number flashed in her mind instantly. She stared at the cash, the green paper looking almost alien in the dim streetlight filtering into the alley. Her first instinct was panic. This wasn't lost money. This was dangerous money. People didn't just leave a fortune next to a dumpster unless something had gone terribly wrong. She slammed the lid shut, her chest heaving. She should run. She should leave it there and sprint as far away as her weak legs would carry her. But then, the pain in her stomach flared, a sharp reminder of her reality. This money could mean a warm bed. It could mean food, hot, steaming food. It could mean a doctor for the chronic cough that had been plaguing her for weeks. It was a ticket out of hell. Tears welled in her eyes, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her with nothing but a Bible and a stern belief in integrity. Character is what you do when no one is watching, Maya. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Maya looked at the suitcase, then down at her dirty hands. She was starving, she was freezing, and she was alone. But she wasn't a thief. The battle raging inside her was more violent than the storm above. If she took it, she survived. If she returned it, she might die on these streets. But if she took it, she would lose the one thing the streets hadn't managed to strip away from her yet: her dignity. She sat down on the cold concrete, pulling the suitcase onto her lap, hugging it not for the wealth inside, but to protect it. She would wait. Whoever lost this would come back. They had to. Across the city, in a penthouse that touched the clouds, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Minho stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that he practically owned. He was a man of sharp angles and terrifying silence, dressed in a black suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. As the head of the Korean syndicate in the city, Minho was not a man who tolerated mistakes. He turned slowly to face the two men kneeling on his white marble floor. They were shaking, sweat dripping from their foreheads despite the air-conditioned chill of the room. Minho's face was unreadable, a mask of calm that hid a volatile storm. "Repeat that," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the room with lethal clarity. "You left the package." "Where?" One of the men stuttered, keeping his eyes glued to the floor. "Boss, it was the drop. The police sirens. We panicked. We stashed it behind the dumpster in the alley on 4th and Main. We circled back 5 minutes later, but the police were patrolling. We couldn't get close." Minho didn't yell. He didn't scream. He simply walked over to his desk and picked up a tablet. He tapped the screen, activating the GPS tracker hidden within the lining of the brown leather suitcase. A small red blinked on the map. It hadn't moved. It was still in the alley. Minho's eyes narrowed. If the police had it, the dot would be moving toward the precinct. If a rival gang had it, it would be halfway across the state by now. But it was stationary. "Get the car," Minho ordered, tossing the tablet onto the sofa. "If that money is gone, you two will wish you were in prison." He grabbed his coat, his mind racing. That money wasn't just profit. It was the payment for a truce with a rival family. Without it, war would break out by morning. He needed that bag. And God help anyone who stood in his way. The black SUV tore through the wet streets, ignoring red lights, sliding around corners with precision. Minho sat in the back, his eyes fixed on the tracker. The dot was still there. He checked the pistol tucked into his holster, a reflex born of habit. He expected an ambush. He expected to find a group of thugs trying to pry the lock open. He did not expect what he found when the car screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trash, the puddles, and a solitary figure huddled against the wall. Minho signaled his driver to stay put. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain. He didn't feel the cold, his adrenaline was too high. He walked into the alley, his shoes clicking on the wet pavement. As he got closer, the figure shifted. It was a woman. She looked small, fragile, swallowed up by a denim jacket that was too big for her. She was sitting on the ground, her arms wrapped protectively around his suitcase. Minho stopped a few feet away, his hand hovering near his jacket, ready to draw his weapon. He stared at her. She was shivering violently, her lips pale, her eyes wide with terror as she looked up at him. She didn't try to run. She didn't try to hide the bag. She just looked at him, and for a second, Minho was struck by the raw vulnerability in her gaze. It was a look he hadn't seen in years, pure, unadulterated fear mixed with a strange defiance. "That belongs to me," Minho said, his voice deep and commanding, cutting through the sound of the rain. He expected her to beg. He expected her to lie. He watched her hands, waiting for a sudden movement, a knife, anything. But she simply nodded, her teeth chattering. Maya struggled to stand, her legs numb from the cold and the awkward position she had been sitting in. She used the wall for support, clutching the handle of the suitcase. She was dizzy, the hunger pangs now a dull, rhythmic ache. She looked at the man before her. He was beautiful in a terrifying way, like a carved statue, flawless and cold. She could see the danger rolling off him in waves. She knew, instinctively, that he was a man who could end her life without a second thought. She held the suitcase out to him, her arms shaking under the weight. I waited," she stammered, her voice hoarse. "I knew someone would come back for it." Minho frowned, confusion flickering across his stoic features. He took the suitcase from her, his gloved hand brushing against her ice-cold fingers. He immediately set it down on the wet asphalt and popped the latches. He lifted the lid. The money was all there. Not a single bill was missing. He looked from the cash to the woman. She was clearly homeless, clearly starving. A single stack of those bills could have changed her life. She could have taken a handful and disappeared, but she hadn't touched a penny. He stood up, closing the case, and looked at her with a new intensity. "You opened it?" he asked. Maya nodded, shame coloring her cheeks. "I did. I'm sorry. I wanted to see." "And you didn't take anything?" Minho asked, stepping closer, invading her personal space. He was trying to intimidate her, trying to find the lie. Why? Maya looked him in the eye, drawing on the last reserves of her strength. "Because it isn't mine," she whispered. "And stealing it wouldn't make me right." The energy required to speak those words seemed to be the last she had. Her vision blurred, the world tilting sideways. The adrenaline that had kept her upright faded, leaving only the exhaustion and the hunger. Her knees buckled. She felt herself falling toward the wet, filthy ground, bracing for the impact. But it never came. Strong arms caught her before she hit the pavement. Minho held her up, shocked by how light she was, how frail her frame felt through the damp denim. He looked down at her unconscious face, rain washing over her skin. He looked at the suitcase, then back at her. For the first time in his life, the ruthlessness in his chest wavered. He couldn't leave her here. Not after this. "Get the door," he barked at his driver, scooping her up into his arms effortlessly. The softness was the first thing Maya noticed. It wasn't the hard, unforgiving concrete of the alley, nor the damp, cardboard texture of a makeshift bed. It was like floating on a cloud, a sensation so foreign to her body that she panicked, gasping as her eyes flew open. She tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pressed her shoulder back down. She blinked, her vision adjusting to the warm, golden light of a room that looked like a palace. She was lying in a bed large enough to sleep a family of 4, covered in sheets that felt like silk against her skin. And 4 Drip was humming quietly beside her, pumping fluids into her dehydrated veins. The air smelled of lavender and sterile cleanliness, a stark contrast to the rot and exhaust fumes she had inhaled for 2 years. Sitting in a velvet armchair beside the bed was Minho. He was no longer wearing his jacket, his dress shirt rolled up to the elbows, revealing a tattoo of a dragon winding down his forearm. He looked tired, his eyes scanning a document on a tablet, but the moment she stirred, his attention snapped to her. "Easy," Minho said, his voice softer than it had been in the alley, though it still carried that underlying edge of authority. "You've been out for 2 days. The doctor said your body was shutting down. Malnutrition, hypothermia, exhaustion." He placed a glass of water on the bedside table, watching her with an intensity that made Maya's breath catch. She pulled the duvet up to her chin, feeling small in the vast luxury of the room. "Why am I here?" she whispered, her voice raspy. "You got your money. You should have just let me go." Minho stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. "I don't owe people often," he said, keeping his back to her. "But in my world, loyalty is the only currency that matters. You held a fortune in your hands and didn't take a dime. That makes you a rarity. It makes you valuable," he turned back to her. "And I don't throw away valuable things." Maya spent the next week recovering in the penthouse, treating the space like a museum she was afraid to break. The transition from invisible to hypervisible was jarring. Servants brought her meals on silver trays, steaming broths, fresh fruit, roasted chicken, food that made her stomach clench with gratitude and shame. She thought of her friends on the street, the ones still freezing in the rain, and the guilt ate at her. Minho watched her closely during this time. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was observant. He noticed how she folded the napkins perfectly, how she cleaned up after herself despite having maids, and how she stared at the financial news playing on the television with a sharp, analytical gaze. One evening, as Minho sat at his massive mahogany dining table surrounded by stacks of ledgers and cash, he groaned. rubbing his temples. A discrepancy in the numbers from the shipping docks was driving him mad. Maya, who had been quietly reading a book in the corner, stood up and walked over. She hesitated, then pointed a slender finger at the column of figures. "You're missing a carryover from the third quarter," she said quietly. "And the tax calculation on the import line is off by 4%. Whoever did this is skimming from the top, hiding it in the variable costs."
Minho froze.
He looked at the paper, doing the mental math rapidly, then looked up at Maya with wide eyes. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Maya didn't flinch. "Before the factory closed. Before my mom got sick and the debts took everything. I was an auditor for a logistics firm. I have a degree in finance. I know numbers. Numbers don't lie. People do." Minho stared at her, seeing her for the first time not just as a charity case or a moral anomaly, but as a weapon. He had been surrounded by thugs who knew how to break legs but couldn't balance a checkbook to save their lives. He was drowning in a sea of incompetence and deceit, and here, in a denim jacket he had rescued from the rain, was a woman who could see the matrix of his empire better than he could. He closed the ledger with a heavy thud. "Sit down," he commanded, pulling out the chair next to him. "Show me the rest." The transformation began the next morning. It wasn't just about new clothes, though the wardrobe Minho provided was exquisite. Tailored suits in charcoal and navy that sharpened Maya's silhouette, replacing the vulnerability of the streets with a formidable armor. It was a transformation of status. Minho didn't hire her as a secretary. He didn't hire her as an accountant. He was doing something unprecedented in the history of his syndicate. He called a meeting of his 5 top lieutenants, men with scars on their faces and blood on their hands, men who ruled the city's districts with iron fists. They gathered in the boardroom of the penthouse, the atmosphere thick with cigar smoke and testosterone. When Minho entered, the room went silent. But when Maya walked in beside him, dressed in a sharp black blazer, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun, confusion rippled through the room. She stood at Minho's right hand, her chin high, her hands clasped behind her back. She was terrified internally, her heart beating like a trapped bird, but she channeled the same steel that had kept her alive in the alley. "Listen closely," Minho's voice boomed, silencing the murmurs. "For 10 years, this family has bled money because of incompetence and greed. I have been looking for someone who cannot be bought. Someone whose integrity is absolute." He placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "This is Maya. As of this moment, she is the chief financial officer and the second in command of all syndicate operations. No deal happens without her signature. No payment goes out without her approval. If she says no, the answer is no. Even if it comes from me," the room erupted. "A woman?" One lieutenant spat, slamming his hand on the table. "A stray you picked up off the street?" "Boss, this is an insult." Minho didn't move. He simply looked at Maya.
It was a test.
Maya stepped forward, locking eyes with the dissenting lieutenant. "It is not an insult," she said, her voice steady and projecting with a power she didn't know she possessed. "It is an audit. And looking at your district's returns from last month, Mr. Kong, you are short 50,000. I suggest you find it before I close your accounts permanently." The silence that followed was deafening. The lieutenant paled, sinking back into his chair. In that moment, Maya wasn't just a survivor. She was the queen of the board. The true test of her power came 3 months later. The syndicate was negotiating a high-stakes merger with a rival faction from the south, a deal that would secure peace in the city for a decade. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse by the docks, a neutral ground that felt anything but safe. Maya stood beside Minho, clutching a briefcase, not one found in a dumpster, but one containing the contracts that would define their future. The rival boss, a man named Viper, smiled with too many teeth. He offered Minho a glass of wine, a gesture of goodwill. The air was tense, every bodyguard in the room holding their breath. Minho reached for the glass, eager to seal the deal and end the violence. But Maya saw something. She saw the slight tremor in Viper's hand. She saw the way his eyes darted to the exits. And she smelled it, the faint, bitter scent of almonds masking the wine's bouquet. Her instincts, honed by years of scanning the streets for danger, screamed at her. "Don't drink it," Maya shouted, slapping the glass from Minho's hand just as it touched his lips. The crystal shattered on the concrete, the red liquid hissing as it reacted with the floor. The room exploded into chaos. Guns were drawn instantly. Viper roared, realizing his assassination attempt had failed. "She's crazy," Viper screamed. "Kill them." But Minho was already moving, shoving Maya behind a concrete pillar as bullets sparked against the metal beams. "Stay down," he yelled, returning fire. But Maya didn't just stay down. She saw the tactical layout of the warehouse. She saw the flank Viper's men were leaving exposed. She grabbed the radio from a fallen bodyguard. "Unit 4, flank left. Cut the power to the east grid, now," she ordered into the comms, her voice cutting through the gunfire. The lights on the east side died instantly, plunging Viper's men into confusion. Minho's forces, guided by Maya's impromptu strategy, swept in and neutralized the threat within minutes. When the smoke cleared, Minho stood over Viper, who was cowering on the ground. Minho didn't look at his enemy. He looked at Maya, who was dusting off her suit, shaking but unharmed. She had saved his life not with a bullet, but with her mind. The drive back to the penthouse was silent, but it was a comfortable silence, heavy with unspoken respect. The rain had started again, mimicking the night they met, but everything had changed. They weren't strangers in an alley anymore. When they arrived, Minho didn't go to his office. He led Maya out to the balcony, where the city lights glittered below them like spilled diamonds. He leaned against the railing, the wind tossing his hair. "I gave you power because I trusted your honesty," Minho said, looking at her with a softness that smoothed the harsh lines of his face. "But tonight, you showed me that you are fit to lead not just because you are good, but because you are strong. You are the partner I never thought I would find." Maya looked out at the streets where she used to sleep. She saw the dark corners, but she no longer felt the fear. She felt a sense of purpose. She had turned a moment of desperation into a destiny. Maya placed her hand over Minho's on the railing. It was a gesture of solidarity, of a bond that went deeper than romance or business.
It was found family.
"We can change things, Minho," she said, her voice filled with a hopeful determination. "With your resources and my vision, we don't have to just run the underworld. We can fix it. We can protect the people who are invisible, like I was." Minho turned his hand over and interlaced his fingers with hers. "Then let's do it," he vowed. "Together." From a homeless woman clutching a suitcase in the rain to the most powerful woman in the city's shadow, Maya's journey proves that integrity is never a weakness. It is the ultimate strength. She didn't just find money that night. She found her worth and she found a home. If this story touched your heart, and if you believe that good things happen to those who stay true to themselves, please share this video with someone you love. Thank you for watching. And remember, even in the darkest alley, there is always a path to the light.